Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at opening the hand and the 3 steps involved, the early, middle, and late phase. And we're also going to be checking out the 3 principles in order to understand it all, and then the muscle activity as well. I hope you guys enjoy the video. All right, so 3 principles that I think are important to understand is, one, is that there's a huge amount of passive tension on the flexor side of the wrist and the fingers. And what I mean by that is when you're just resting your hand, you have a little bit of wrist extension and you have a lot of finger flexion. And that's because of all the passive tension on the flexor side of the wrist and hand. And you have to overcome that in order to open up your fingers. So that's one thing we have to overcome in order to get your fingers into full extension. Another thing that's important is that active insufficiency would take place if wrist flexors were not active. And so what we're going to see here in a little bit is that wrist flexors, like flexor carpi radialis, turn on in order to make it so that active insufficiency doesn't take place. And so when you rapidly open your hand into extension, I go from wrist extension to wrist flexion, and that's my wrist flexors turning on to avoid active insufficiency of extensor digitorum. Or if extensor digitorum was the only thing that turned on, I would go into wrist extension and finger extension, and I would be extremely ineffective if I just wouldn't be as strong that way. And then the third principle is that the oblique retinocular ligament becomes taut and produces an extension torque after PIP extension. And that's part of how we can fully extend our fingers, because of this oblique retinocular ligament. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. And if the oblique retinocular ligament doesn't make sense, or you're kind of unfamiliar with it, you can check out last week's video, which is on the extensor mechanism, and hopefully it's explained well there. What you're going to see consistently in the 3 phases are that in the early, the middle, and the late phase is that all the same muscles are turned on, but the joints are in different positions. So the 3 groups of muscles that are turned on is, the big one is extensor digitorum. That's like the big one that causes the extension of the fingers. The other one is the lumbricals mixed in with the interossei. So that's palmar and dorsal interossei. And last but not least I'm just going to use flexor carpi radialis, but other wrist flexors are also involved. And just a little bit of review. Extensor digitorum starts on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and crosses a ton of joints on the wrist and fingers, and then because it attaches to the extensor mechanism, it's going to assist with extension of all the joints in the fingers. And lumbricals and interossei, they pass on the anterior side of the MCP joint, so they're going to produce flexion at the MCP joint, but then extension at the interphalangeal joints. And then flexor carpi radialis attaches to the carpal bones of the wrist, and so it primarily just is going to flex the wrist. And that's important because of this second point here, is that this prevents active insufficiency of extensor digitorum, and lumbricals and interossei kind of do the same thing because they produce that flexion torque at the metacarpal phalangeal joint. And that extensor digitorum is like the main driver of this whole thing. And so now we're going to go into the steps of the early, middle, and late phase, and hopefully it all makes sense for you guys. muscles we talked about turn on right now. So we have extensor digitorum. Extensor digitorum turns on and produces extension mostly at the MCP joint. So now, in order to counteract wrist extension, to decrease wrist extension, flexor carpi radialis and other wrist flexors turn on. Flexor carpi radialis turns on. And then this last one, lumbricals and interossei, are helping counteract the big strong force of extensor digitorum because they do MCP flexion, but then they're also going to assist later on in PIP extension and DIP extension. So lumbricals and interossei turn on in order to counteract strong extension torque at MCPs. So we've got all three of the muscles we talked about turning on right now, except the extensor digitorum is primarily focused at the MCPs. In order to counteract that strong pull, lumbricals and interossei are turning on because they do a little bit of MCP flexion, and then to decrease wrist extension also by extensor digitorum, flexor carpi radialis turns on. So pretty much we've got extensor digitorum turning on, and then the wrist flexors and lumbricals, interossei kind of managing the strong forces that that muscle produces. Now during this middle phase, it's very similar to the early phase. So all the same stuff, all the same muscles are still on. So we have extensor digitorum, it's still on, but instead of just producing a torque mostly at the MCPs, now it's going to produce a torque at the PIP joint and the DIP joint. So extensor digitorum, it's still on, but now it's focused on the PIP and DIP joints. Okay, and then we have lumbricals and interossei, they're still on, and they're still counteracting the strong torque at the MCP joint, but now they're going to assist extensor digitorum in extension of the PIP and DIP joint. So we have lumbricals and the interossei. So they're still counteracting at MCP, but contributing but now they're going to start contributing at the PIP and DIP joints. And as well as this early phase, the muscles like the flexor carpi radialis are still going to be turned on to continue to control the extension at the fingers without causing wrist extension from extensor digitorum. So flexor carpi radialis and other wrist flexors are going to be continue to be on, to be turned on, to prevent wrist extension. Okay. All right, so now we're on the late phase. So all the same stuff that's been happening continues to happen. So same as before, except a few things. So we'll just say same as before, and then to add on to this, now we're going to have a few other things happen. So instead of wrist flexors like flexor carpi radialis, keeping the wrist in neutral, now in order to get the hand fully open, it's going to produce a little bit of wrist flexion. So flexor carpi radialis, instead of neutral, wrist, it's now going to produce a little bit of flexion. It now produces a little flexion. And the purpose of this is what we talked about earlier, is that if this didn't happen, there would be active insufficiency of extensor digitorum, and you wouldn't be that strong all the way out here if I just let extensor digitorum open up my wrist. And plus, you never grab objects like this. You always have, it also helps with extending your reach too. So yeah, so this is one thing that's different in the late phase. Another thing that's different is the lumbricals now have a dual role. So remember what we talked about at the very beginning, that the lumbricals turned on in order to counteract the MCPs. So they're still doing that. Lumbricals counteracting. Come on. Lumbricals counteracting extensor digitorum at MCPs, also because of that active insufficiency. So they're doing that. They produce, oh gosh. They're producing extension at PIPs and DIPs, but this might be their most important role, is because the lumbricals attachment on the flexor digitorum profundus tendons, that when they shorten, they're pulling up the slack on flexor digitorum profundus. And remember at the very beginning, we have all this passive tension. And when you use lumbricals specifically to produce flexion at the MCPs and extension at the PIP and DIP, they also, on top of doing that, they're also going to put in a little bit of slack of the flexor digitorum profundus. So they're going to shorten. So if this was the tendon of flexor digitorum profundus, the lumbricals come from here and attach on to flexor digitorum profundus. And so when this muscle shortens, it's going to put in a little bit of slack, which makes it a lot easier to extend all these joints. So that's super crucial. So the lumbricals are doing a ton here. They're doing counteracting the big extension torque at the MCP joint to just focus it to a little bit of extension torque. They produce extension at the PIP and the DIP, And then they're also putting in a little bit of slack in the flexor digitorum profundus tendon. So they put slack in flexor digitorum profundus tendons, which is extremely important because one of the hardest parts about opening the hand is that you have to overcome all this passive tension on the flexor side, which we talked about earlier. And then the last thing, which is also super important in this late phase, is that oblique retinocular ligament that we talked about in the extensor mechanism video. So this is the oblique retinocular ligament coming off of these lateral bands. So it's this one right here, attaching to the annular pulley. And after the PIP joint, which is right here, goes into extension, the oblique retinocular ligament goes behind the axis at the PIP joint, and then also this is when it gets taut. And so this is the oblique retinocular ligament. It gets taut after PIP extension, and then also contributes to this extension torque in order to fully open your hand. So the oblique retinocular ligament, ORL, becomes taut after PIP extension. Oblique retinocular ligament becomes taut after PIP extension and produces extension torque at DIPs. And so all these steps, the early, middle, late phase, all the muscle activity, all that needs to happen in order to fully open your hand all the way. And if it breaks down any step of the way, if you have nerve damage or muscle weakness, you won't be able to open your hand all the way. All right, just to recap this whole thing, we're going to start with the three principles. There's a huge amount of passive tension that we need to overcome on the flexor side of the hand, especially flexor digitorum, superficialis, and profundus. And so another thing is that active insufficiency would take place if we didn't control all of the actions of extensor digitorum. And since it extends the wrist and extends all the fingers, we have to control what it extends well by putting in wrist flexion and putting in MCP flexion to make it so that it can do its thing all the way throughout the whole back of the hand. And then the last thing that's important is the oblique retinocular ligament becomes taut after PIP extension and then contributes to that extension torque all the way at the end of the extensor mechanism. So muscles that are always active throughout the early, middle, and late phase is extensor digitorum, lumbricals and interossei, and flexor carpi radialis and other wrist flexors to control that extension torque of extensor digitorum. And so in this early phase, it's the basic phase. All those muscles just turn on. Extensor digitorum primarily is extending at the MCP joint. Flexor carpi radialis continues, or let's say starts, wrist flexion. And then lumbricals and interossei counteract the strong extension torque at the MCPs. That's early phase. Middle phase is flexor carpi radialis. Keeps doing its thing, doing that wrist flexion primarily at neutral. Extensor digitorum, instead of being primarily at the MCP joint, it's now focusing its torque at the PIP and the DIP joint. The lumbricals and interossei are still counteracting at the MCP, but now they're also contributing at the PIP and DIP joint. And then flexor carpi radialis continues to be turned on to prevent wrist extension. Now this late phase is the most complicated one. All this same stuff is still happening, except now the wrist, instead of being neutral, even though it looks neutral here, which it is, but it's a little bit of wrist flexion, like my hand here. And Lumbricals are doing all those things as before. They're counteracting MCP extension by extensor digitorum by producing a flexion torque here, but then they're doing extension at the PIP and the DIP joint. And then the lumbricals specifically, because of their attachment on flexor digitorum profundus, which comes all the way out to the end, and because of all that passive tension that flexor digitorum profundus has, when lumbricals contract, they put this slack in flexor digitorum profundus, which helps overcome that passive tension as well as continue to produce an extension torque at the PIP and the DIP joint. And the last thing that's important is oblique retinocular ligament becomes taut after the lumbricals and extensor digitorum are doing their thing at the PIP joint. So after PIP extension, this oblique retinocular ligament falls behind this axis and produces an extension torque and helps contribute to all this muscle activity, and you get extension all the way out. I hope you guys liked today's video, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. And if this doesn't make sense, hopefully you can go back and watch the extensor mechanism video and watch this one again, and hopefully the dots just start clicking and it all makes sense. I hope you guys have a great day. See ya.